make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Often conservative evangelical Christians today use representation to say that they are now in the minority, that they are the oppressed group, when I think most empirical research, says otherwise, as you point out, that, there's still discrimination, there's still mental and physical health concerns where LGBT people are lagging behind their straight, cis counterparts. So, media representation that may veer more liberal or progressive is not necessarily representative of, the reality of our country today.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you are watching us on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and your faithful host, Josh Bertram, can't be with us today, but instead we have with us Dr. Kelsy Burke. She's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Dr. Burke is a renowned scholar and specializes in the intersection of religion, sexuality, and the digital world. She's the author of the groundbreaking book, Christians, Undercovers, Evangelicals and Sexual Pleasure on the Internet, which provides a unique exploration of how religious individuals navigate their sexuality in the digital age. And she's also the author of the Pornography Wars, the past, present, and the future of America's obscene obsession. So we are really, really happy to have her on the show. And yeah, thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Your field of study and research is sexuality and religion, which seems like an odd pairing. So maybe you can kind of explain to us, did you wake up one day and just thought, you know what I want to do? I want to do this. This makes sense. So how did you get into this field?
Well, I think like many scholars, my research areas really come from my personal biography. Growing up, I grew up actually in a Methodist church, but when I was a teenager, I became involved in the local Baptist church in my small town in Wyoming. I was saved, became a born-again Christian, and was just really involved in my church community. This was at the same time when I was hearing a lot of messages about sex and sexuality as a teenager, and I knew at the time that they didn't line up with my growing sense of who I was. I came out as a queer person in my early 20s. I ended up leaving my Baptist church, but these two topics, religion and sexuality, were really formative for me. And I think often we think about them as being in tension with one another, but they were really a part of my lived experience as a young person, really up into the present. I like to joke that, I grew up in a really small town in Wyoming, and so therapy wasn't exactly a thing. So maybe I could have done that to reckon with some of these things in my life. But instead, I went to graduate school in sociology and started studying these topics. And that has sort of taken me up to the present.
That's so interesting. So is your is part of your education theology and biology also, or is it much more broader kind of than that?
That's an interesting question. I like to say now that I'm a sociologist of religion. So I study religious people, but I don't study religion per se. So what I do is not theology. And in my own personal life, I was really immersed in a sort of conservative evangelical space for many years. And now I'm a member of a progressive church in my town, but would not say that what brings me to that space is necessarily theology. So from the sociology side of things, I study people and how they make sense of the world. And in my work, I don't take a stand on whether or not that's right or wrong, true or not true. That's not really my job as I see it. There's plenty of people who do that work, and that's not for me.
Yeah, I have a profound sense of appreciation for anybody that is a believer and is also part of the LGBTQ community. Because, I mean, so, part of my background, I born and raised in California, very liberal. Moved to Virginia about 10 years ago or something, not very liberal. But I didn't grow up as a Christian. I grew up as an atheist, really. I mean, and a lot of the things that kind of kept me from the faith was, I don't know, just the relentless persecution of gays and lesbians and what have you. I mean, most of my best friends were gay, and I'm just like, you faith people are just like hypocrites. So anybody that is from both communities, I just have profound respect for, because I'm like, you're navigating a space that is probably akin to, I don't know, like minorities during Jim Crow era, trying to like worship, believe in God, but also have the same, like a lot of white evangelicals from the other side also oppress you. So like, how do you navigate that, like in your personal life?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the experience of a lot of people, is this sort of tension or conflict that they have to navigate. For me, I left religious communities for, almost 20 years, about 15 years maybe. And just sort of set that aside. And so I was studying religion, but I wasn't, and I was going to church actually quite a bit, but as a sociologist conducting research, not personally. And it was actually the Sunday after the 2016 presidential election that I woke up and told my family, my, queer family, we're going to church this morning. And so we went to the Unitarian church in our city, which is not explicitly, Christian. There are Unitarians who are atheists or Jewish, or, it's a vast array of folks who find themselves calling them Unitarian Universalists. But that was the space that we found, and that really stuck. And so it's a space that I think is unlike many other, especially Christian or conservative Protestant denominations, in that kind of tension or conflict really doesn't exist. So they base their major beliefs on this sense of inclusion. And that has been a way for me, I think, to find myself saying that I am actually a deeply religious person and also a queer person.
That's awesome. So talk to us about your book. So you wrote two books that have very similar overtones, but very, I'm sure, differently by their content. So you wrote the first book was Christians Undercovers. Like what led you to write the book, and what are some things a reader would learn from your research?
Well, the book is based on my dissertation, and so I had to come up with a topic, what I was going to write my dissertation about. And I knew I wanted to study something related to conservative Christianity and evangelicalism and sexuality. And so I was attending a women's Bible study as a researcher at a large evangelical church outside of the city I was living in. And it was a women's Bible study to talk about like issues of womanhood. And there was one particular night where we were talking about the importance of women dressing modestly so as to not tempt the men in their lives that they weren't married to. And there was one woman who was just getting sort of visibly agitated. And she finally spoke up and said, I'm just so sick of hearing this message about how it's women's job to, dress in a certain way so as to not tempt men. I believe that God created sexiness actually for the pleasure of married couples. And so when I show some cleavage and wear red lipstick, I'm doing this for my husband. And I think God's okay with that. And everybody, it was sort of this uncomfortable moment. Nobody really knew what to say. And I was really blown away because I had never heard that kind of talk in a church setting before. So I actually went home and Googled, I think I Googled something like Christian women sexy dressing or something. I was like, what are there other people having these kinds of conversations? And what I found was this wide array of online blogs and message boards, some online stores that are all created created by and for evangelical Christians to promote this idea that God wants for them, so long as they are straight and married, to have great sex. And so I decided that this would become the focus of my dissertation. I spent about 2 years engaged in what is called a virtual ethnography, so really immersing myself in these online spaces. I think the websites exist and are so popular because it's a pretty straightforward and conventional idea that God created married sexuality to be something like really special, intimate, pleasurable. But in practice, it doesn't really necessarily work out that way. So especially for couples who grow up in churches that hear this kind of constant refrain about sex, which is no, don't do it, that they have a lot of questions and often have to troubleshoot some challenges, which they can do by finding an online community. So the best analogy that I can use to sum up what I think is the big takeaway from that book and from these online communities is that of, I write about it in the conclusion of the book, desire paths, which is a term that actually comes from urban landscape design. And so like, just imagine that you're in a big city park. And so there's a bunch of paved sidewalks that you can take to get various places. But then you might also notice some pathways that have been created like through the grass or through the dirt, simply because those are the routes that people take. So, maybe there's more than one way to get to the playground because there's a more direct way than just following the sidewalk. So these paths that people walk over and over again are not the ones that were originally designed by city landscapers. And so I think about Christian sex advice websites as a kind of desire path that sometimes they sort of parallel the conventional or mainstream Christian beliefs or marriage advice books, but sometimes they can go in some pretty different directions. And they don't need the permission of a religious authorities to do that. So this is something that's sort of uniquely Protestant in that believers believe they can talk directly to God and that they have a kind of authority over their beliefs and their lives. It's not a total free-for-all, so it's not like anything goes. So we can kind of think about, like, back to the city park analogy, there are some like big oak trees of heterosexuality and marriage and monogamy that you can't really cut down or climb over. And so there are these core values, but there's also a lot of space for freedom within these online communities.
Are you familiar with? I think it's Sheila Ray Gregoire.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, we had her on, I don't know, a couple months ago or whatever, and it was the first time that we had somebody, excuse me, talk about this stuff on our program, and obviously, like, I don't know, Josh and I were a little bit uncomfortable because we're two dudes, talking to this woman who's talking about sex, and like, but it was really enlightening, I mean, and she, I think, did a good job just trying to unpack maybe some of the, I don't know if it's like just old church hurt or whatever of people just not wanting to talk about sex. And it seems like you're sort of approaching that head on with like all your research and stuff from your book. So, hats off to you. Maybe we can switch gears and talk about the pornography war. So, I had actually first thought that your book, Christians Undercover, kind of the last part about the internet, dealt with pornography. But it sounds like it's more about like your determined routes that you were talking about in sort of the community that you've managed to, form online. So what's different with Pornography Wars?
Yeah, these online Christian sex advice websites talk a lot about porn and pornography, and that was something that I wrote about really very little, especially given the amount of space they dedicate to the topic. I didn't really touch it in Christians Undercovers because it felt like too big a can of worms. But it was always in the back of my mind, especially how evangelical men tended to talk about porn in ways that wasn't about the sinfulness of porn, though they would agree that it was morally wrong and sinful to look at pornography, but that the language they tended to use online was about being physically addicted to pornography, and that this was all but an epidemic that was affecting, virtually all Christian men. This was sort of the implication online. And I thought, isn't that interesting how they're talking about porn? And so I thought that I would design an interview-based study where I'd interview some guys who participate in porn addiction recovery groups to ask them about their experiences, and sort of that would be that. I would be done with that topic. Maybe I'd go on to study something else. But what I found was that I had a lot more questions after I conducted those interviews. And it culminated into what is my latest book, The Pornography Wars. And I would say if I had to sum up its big takeaway, it's that I'm not setting out to convey some ultimate truth about internet pornography, but rather to explain how multiple truths come to be told from different vantage points. Probably for religious listeners that who really strongly believe in a kind of capital T truth, that might not sit that well. But from a sociological perspective, we know that it's true that watching porn can cause a lot of problems in the lives of especially men who watch it while believing that it's morally wrong or physically addictive. But at the same time, it's also true that some people, including women, a lot of queer-identified people, find that watching porn can actually be a source of affirmation and acceptance for their sexual desires. On the industry side, I heard many stories about how porn performers experienced abuse and coercion in the industry. Some of them felt like they had to leave the industry and actually speak out against it and become a part of the anti-porn movement. But for other sex workers that I spoke with, actually choosing internet porn became the most enjoyable and flexible form of work that they found, even when they had other options available to them. So that's what I mean when I say that there is multiple truths that can exist at the same time when it comes to porn. And I think the danger is that messaging about pornography often stems from groups with religious or political ties, which can give the illusion that we know what's going on with porn when actually we might be missing some important perspectives. So I tried to give voice to some of those perspectives.
Yeah, I've been somewhat indifferent about porn before I got married. So I was former military. It's in the infantry, and early in my military career, I would be in a barracks with 300 men because women weren't allowed to be in the infantry. So, and porn was just everywhere. Just everywhere. And I don't recall a time where, I sat with some of my battle buddies, debating the right or wrongness of the stuff that was just everywhere in the barracks. It wasn't until I became a Christian where I started viewing pornography in a much different capacity, different lens. And I'm curious on what your experience is, talking with people. Is it only Christians that perceive pornography as this ultimate evil that will destroy relationships, anytime that somebody watches it?
Mm-hmm. So before I answer that question, I just think it's interesting that you bring up the. Are we still there?
Yeah. Sorry. Your video just stuck for a little bit, but
okay.
I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Your story about being in the Army is actually the moment at which I start the pornography wars in America, which is at the time of the Civil War, when Protestant leaders started speaking out against illicit literature and photographs that were prominent in Civil War Army camps, that this was, sort of a fight over the future of our nation, which included the sort of moral identity of our nation. And so that's when porn really becomes this contested political and social issue, is having to do with the Civil War. I think your question, is this just a religious problem? It sort of seems to be at the heart of what you're asking about. And the straightforward answer is no. We do know that if conservative men are more likely to report that they are addicted to pornography than any other group, even when they tend to look at porn less than, say, non-religious men. And I think that's because there's a lot of messaging, especially in conservative evangelical spaces, about men and porn. So it's, one guy told me that it was the quote unquote popular sin to talk about in his youth group growing up. So it's really normalized at the same time that, Christian leaders take sort of a firm stance that you shouldn't be doing it. It's also expected that, young men have this tendency to want to do it or will do it. So I think that's why we see these conversations really happening in Christian spaces. I think evangelical Protestants have really capitalized on pornography addiction in particular, and have made the recovery movement really a profit-making enterprise. So there are books that you can buy, there are courses you can sign up for, there are software programs you can subscribe to, much like a Netflix subscription, where you can have these accountability programs. So I think that's why this topic is really prevalent within particularly evangelical Christian communities. But it's also true, and one of the main sort of messages that they try to get through within these spaces is that pornography should be of concern to all people, regardless of their moral beliefs about porn. They point to what they see as scientific and objective harms that come from watching it or from participating in the industry. I think that the science is still more or less out on some of those claims. But certainly I spoke to people who were religious, who were not religious, who were a part of, a broader anti-porn movement.
Yeah, because I remember, so when I got saved back in 2008. And actually, it was my wife, who's a PK, was the one that brought me to Christ. And I remember, going to church, hearing discussions or talk about porn. And even like when I became a youth pastor, like I remember just myself just telling like our kids, the how bad porn is and how it rewires your brain. I mean, I had like zero things to base it on. This is just stuff I heard from like other religious leaders in the community, and, how like, the first person you have sex with, you'll imprint yourself with them forever. And like, kind of like, an owner and a dog, or I don't know. it was the things that I was told, I don't know, made sense to me at the time. I had just drank the Jesus juice, and I was like, hey, like, okay, these guys have been Christians much longer than I have, so I'm just gonna repeat what they say because obviously they can't be wrong. So like how does porn affect our brain, our bodies, our spirit, and if you don't have any scientific data to back that up, I'd be curious just on your own personal experience just through your research.
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer, actually, even though a lot of people say they have the definitive answer. That for me is the first sort of red flag of like, no, I think it's a little bit more complicated than maybe the picture that you're painting. I think it's absolutely true that especially digital media, but anything that we do repeatedly over time affects our brain. That's what it means when we talk about brain plasticity, right? That our brain adapts and responds to our habits, our environment. So I think that is something that all scientists would agree on, and that digital media in particular, we can be at risk to use compulsively because of the instantaneous new content that is really endless. So that's true not just with pornography, but with basically that's how social media functions. And this, of course, is of concern to many people. I'm a parent of a tween, so I'm thinking about screen use and these issues as well, far outside of the context of porn. So I think that absolutely it's fair to say, yeah, spending many hours a day watching porn is going to physically affect you. It's different, though, to say that pornography is addictive in the same way that, say, drugs or alcohol can be addictive. And that's because it's really hard to empirically test that. So a lot of what we know about physical addictions come from experiments on rats. It turns out that rats' brains are quite similar in their neurological processes to humans.
Avid porn watchers too, right?
Well, so we can't know. We can't know because rats don't respond to this category that is called behavioral addictions. So rats don't respond to pornography, and they don't respond to shopping, and they don't respond to gambling, all these things that we see people use compulsively to their detriment, but we don't exactly know what's happening if it's analogous to drug use, and that there's mixed results in the studies that have attempted to empirically test this. So what I think we do know for certain is that your experience with pornography and how you make meaning of it. So if you feel like it really falls outside of your belief system when it comes to what you think matters for a healthy relationship, for how you spend your time. So if you hold those beliefs, but you look at porn anyway, that's not going to be good for you. If you look at porn and do it in secret because you feel bad about it and you don't want to tell your friends or family or your spouse, that's going to be bad for you. So I think the science is clear on those outcomes, but that's not necessarily a problem of porn per se. That's about how we relate to it. So I try to make that clear in the book that I'm not taking any stand. And it's interesting. I've gotten a lot of pushback actually from both of the quote unquote sides that I write about, which kind of makes me think, well, maybe I'm in the right space, that I'm really not trying to advocate for a particular position, but to say that it's probably more complicated than our initial impressions are.
Interesting. There's a Greek philosopher, Paracelsus, I think is his name, where he says, it's the dose that makes the poison. And it sounds like that's the case. I mean, too much porn, bad, too much water, bad, too much fire, bad. So, that's interesting. I am curious about you mentioned something about social media. Like what effect do you think social media has had, especially with like the way we talk about porn, or maybe even, our accessibility to access porn. Because I'd imagine, access to porn back in the Civil War days, vastly different than it is today in 2023.
Absolutely. Yeah, the internet, in a lot of ways changed everything when it comes to all facets of our lives. And that certainly includes pornography and sexual content. So never before have we had such instant access to porn. Never before have we been able to access it in such an anonymous way. So in decades past, you had to go down to maybe a video rental store or to a magazine booth. You had to go to a public theater. So all of that can be done now in the privacy of your own home with all of these devices that we're carrying around in our pockets. So absolutely, that's changed our relationship to how we access porn, but it's also really changed the porn industry itself. So it's a myth that people say that pornographers are making billions of dollars a year, because in fact, performers can no longer make a living working in porn alone, because the profits go towards the websites who own these various platforms. They don't go back to performers themselves. So I think that there's criticism to be had when it comes to those websites that own pornographic websites and how they regulate content. And there's a lot of groups that are trying to increase awareness about those harms. Often those are groups, though, that have religious backgrounds or religious ties. And so they think that all forms of sex work or all forms of pornography are wrong or bad, no matter the context in which it's produced. And so what sex workers say is that those groups that are trying to speak out against the harms that are present in the porn industry actually aren't helping their lives because they are saying that they're not victims within the industry, that they just want to improve it and make it better, but that they can't find dialogue with some of those more conservative groups.
Like, is this kind of a uniquely American problem, or like are other countries that, have legalized sex work, going through the same thing?
Again, and this is maybe such a not satisfying answer, like it sort of depends. Certainly different countries have different laws and policies when it comes to sex work, prostitution, and internet regulations. It's not a uniquely American problem, sort of how to deal with sexual content online, though I think what is uniquely American, and this is why I situate all of my work within the United States, is that I think our history with religion is what makes debates over porn so interesting for me as a sociologist, but also that they're very much a part of public conversations in a way that they might not be in other places where public religion is not so prevalent.
Interesting. Maybe I'll ask. I have Andrew Whitehead coming on the show here next week or the week thereafter. Maybe I'll throw him a curveball and ask him questions about sexuality. We're mainly going to be talking about Christian nationalism, but every once in a while I like to throw people off their game. But I do want to talk about sort of like the discourse that students are exposed to information about sex. I mean, like, I think. There is a growing effort for, some school districts to omit discussions about trans or, other sort of like non-heterosexual gender identities and what have you. And we already see kind of some of this play out with like the most recent AP African history stuff in Florida, and kind of redefining certain elements of their curriculum. So how do you see, the discussion about sexuality, kind of unfolding in America today, like, especially, for high schoolers?
Yeah, this is a huge area of concern, I think, for me personally. And it's also, I think, taps into anybody who's interested in politics and religion and sexuality. I think people pushing these laws, as in Florida, where, we've had bans on not just certain accounts of U.S. history, but also of really acknowledging any sense of gender or sexual diversity. So to outlaw AP psychology because it recognizes sort of the existence or reality that some people identify as trans or non-binary. So the people pushing these laws, as in Florida, I think we know don't represent most Americans. So a survey just came out a couple of months ago from the Public Religion Research Institute that I'm affiliated with. This is a nonpartisan, non-religious research organization. And they found that the majority of Americans actually do think that it's appropriate to teach and acknowledge the existence of LGBT people in K through 12 schools in some capacity. When Florida first passed its so-called Don't Say Gay law, the governor, Ron DeSantis, justified it by claiming what he called pornographic materials were readily available in elementary schools across the state. And I think people can rally behind this message, or that, there shouldn't be porn available to children really in any grade. Mm-hmm. But in fact, this is really a dog whistle talking about sexual or sexualized content, because it's actually being used to refer to anything that acknowledges even LGBT characters, even in works that might have nothing overtly sexual within them. or acknowledging victims of sexual assault or violence, for example. So I think these laws reflect a broader strategy that conservatives are using to sexualize LGBT people and make LGBT people seem like predators. Another example of this is bans on minors attending drag performances, and including like drag queen story hours, where drag queens read children books to kids in public libraries. So this is something that doesn't have anything to do with sexuality per se, but it's assumed to be so just because of the presence of drag queens. And, I think this denies the full personhood of LGBTQ people. And it certainly makes any productive dialogue across political divides feel kind of impossible or hard to achieve.
Yeah. And, I think one thing that my wife and I struggle with, so we got two boys, 7 and 9. And, we live in the South, 20 minutes from the capital of the Confederacy. So we struggle with making sure our kids are exposed to all different kinds of cultures, experiences. I mean, if there was a drag, queen story hour, we would probably attend because we just think it's important. And also any reason we can get our kids to listen to somebody read a book, I don't care what you look like kind of thing. But what are your recommendations to help, families that want their kids to kind of have that kind of exposure? Because I know I forgot what Disney movie. Oh, maybe I think it was the Buzz Lightyear movie. There is a lesbian couple. I can't remember who the characters were, but anyways, when I watched it with my kids, I saw their faces kind of, cocked sideways, because in their mind, they never really seen that before. So then I explained it to them. I said, hey, sometimes who you're attracted to. I don't think I used that word, but I said who you like, it doesn't necessarily have to reflect what, the world shows you, or, just because mom and dad are different genders, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to like the opposite gender. And I'm sure I worded it in a much different way, but I was having these conversations with my kids. So how do you, or what do you recommend parents do to help their kids better understand the world? Because I'm not in the seat that I want to erase the entire existence of a people group within America. I just think that's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my best answer to that is that there are many professionals who have dedicated their careers to answering that question. People who specialize in educational psychology and LGBTQ issues, and that this is part of what these laws are trying to erase the very important work that they've done to think about how can we, in an age-appropriate way, teach about issues having to do with gender identity, teach social studies and history curriculum, that there are professionals who have figured this out for us, and that it's a very specific political movement that is trying to claim that they know otherwise. And I also think that, this is sort of answering your question, maybe it's sidestepping it a little bit, but what it brings up for me, I think, is how often conservative Christians attempt to hold claim to all religious values when it comes to gender and sexuality issues. So for me, thinking about both diversity across gender sexuality spectrum is to enforce the idea that there is also religious diversity when it comes to how we understand and make sense of these topics. So there isn't a single religious community that has consensus on gender and sexuality issues. And in fact, we have national data that suggests that the majority of many religious traditions, so white mainline Protestants, Black Protestants, Catholic Jews, other non-Christian traditions, are all supportive of a variety of measures of LGBTQ equality, are supportive of LGBTQ relationships and identities. So it's really white evangelical Protestants who stand out in opposition to, a more inclusive or progressive understanding of gender and sexuality. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but I do think that we're living in this cultural and political moment where conservative Christian faith has been directly connected to very specific conservative beliefs about gender and sexuality, but that's not actually, the holistic account of how we can make sense of these issues within churches, within schools, within broader communities.
Yeah, I've always thought that, the conservative Christians in the country would probably benefit from having, or I should say conservative pastors would benefit from having some something in seminary that really kind of digs deep into, what the Bible says about their beliefs about LGBTQ. I mean, I wish Josh was here because him and I had a conversation recently where we were just discussing, this wasn't on air, but we were talking about LGBTQ issues, and he's very much of the mindset, marriage, man, woman, kind of, that's it. But I told him, I said, we've had dozens of theologians on our show that we've talked to. And I go out of my way to make sure I ask them hey, what do you think about, gay marriage and blah, 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 and I can't remember a single theologian that actually, showed me chapter and verse of why it's wrong. I mean, and I would say, if anything, I could probably make, as a non-theologian, a pretty good argument of why Christians shouldn't care about this stuff and just treat people as human, and so my question to Josh is, if you reached a point where you believed that you were wrong, would you publicly say that? And if not, would you be more constrained by your politics, or would you be more constrained by, the effect it may have on the church? And, it was a hard question, and I won't necessarily, disclose how he answered, but I really do think we need to have more conversations like that. And I'm curious on what can churches do to address, the diverse, views on sexuality, pornography, and all the sort of hot button issues that revolve around sex.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think you point to the fact that ordinary people are, for the most part, not approaching these topics. Even if they come from a conservative background, they're not approaching LGBTQ issues with animosity. And I think they're really trying to figure this out. It reminds me of an ongoing project I'm working on. I've been interviewing Christians who support anti-transgender laws that have been proposed and passed in many states in this past year. I interviewed one woman who was a grandma, and her grandchild had recently come out as transgender, and they were no longer speaking to one another. And she told me this with just so much emotion that it really broke her heart, that she continued to send cards and to make phone calls, but none of these were returned. And she said, I just don't know what to do. And I asked, well, why do you think your grandchild was refusing to be in contact, that they used to be quite close? And she said, oh, I know the reason. It's that I won't use and then she used air quotes, the right pronouns and name. And so I gently tried to push her, basically, why not? Why do these words matter so much to you, when this relationship seems to be so important? And she said that she went to a training with a conservative evangelical political organization that gave participants a handout with a list of words that they were never supposed to use when it comes to the quote unquote transgender issue. And on that list was to use a person's name or pronouns if different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. Also, that's a phrase, by the way, that they say people should avoid. And they say that this, ultimately harms people more than it helps them to reinforce what they consider to be, what they call a quote unquote delusion. But I that story comes up for me, I think, because doing that interview really humanized for me many conservative Christians beyond the politicians or the leaders who are making so much noise in public discourse, but who are listening to that discourse and trying to then navigate their relationships in real lives. And, for me, I think this is maybe more a personal than a professional answer, but that the task is to not perceive inclusivity and understanding as a threat to a devout Christian faith, that so much of the public discourse really does see this as like, these things are like oil and water. They don't go together. But like, what if that weren't true? What if that weren't the case?
Yeah. It's like in the broader debate about, LGBTQ issues or, and how they're represented in the public. I feel I have an easier time explaining this to my friends because I can just put it in context of like, segregation or what have you. My wife is white, and I often tell friends. I remember, when I started seeing interracial couples like on television shows or movies, like, and what impact that had on me, because I'd always been attracted to like white, like females. And it sort of like, it made it okay because like I grew up in Los Angeles, most people that were dating like other Black people. And I was like, I'm not really interested in black women. And if you're a Black woman listening to this, I apologize. Please don't send me hate mail. I'm married anyway. So, so it was good to see just representation of who I identified with. And I feel that, people that, I don't know, like rally against representation don't really understand the full impact of what that has. And you're just going to force people to become more closeted. And you'll see, suicide rise and whatnot. So I guess could I get your thoughts on sort of that comparison of, having representation of biracial couples versus representation of folks in the LGBTQ community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, in both cases, the reaction against that representation is so much based in fear, fear that, the dominant majority of white, straight, the quote unquote nuclear family, is at risk or is under threat. And I think that there are a lot of parallels between race, gender, and sexuality when it comes to some shared experiences as marginalized groups, even though there's certainly sort of distinct facets of those histories and how it plays out in present day. But I think that it's really interesting to ask about like why representation is seen as threatening, and I think that often conservative evangelical Christians today use representation to say that they are now in the minority, that they are the oppressed group, when I think most empirical research, says otherwise, as you point out, that, there's still discrimination, there's still mental and physical health concerns where LGBT people are lagging behind their straight, cis counterparts. So, media representation that may veer more liberal or progressive is not necessarily representative of, the reality of our country today.
Yeah, it's sad because when people think about LGBTQ stuff or use of pronouns, they always kind of think of Democrats or they think of progressives, but like there are conservative queer people. I mean, like the log cabin Republicans, it's like a good example. I mean, like when I tell other Republican friends, they're like, what? There's a whole caucus full of people that are gay and Republican? I was like, yeah, and they hate Joe Biden just as much as you do, like these people exist. They're everywhere, and we can't just ignore them. But I'm curious, kind of as we're getting close to time here, like what are some of the pressing issues of the day that revolve around, religion, sexuality, digital culture stuff that you're looking at?
Yeah, one of the things I think that I'm always paying attention to as a researcher is the way that all of these things that we've talked about tend to overlap within laws and policies. So I mentioned before Florida's Don't Say Gay law, the House Bill 1557, conflates really pornography with acknowledging LGBT people. This is true also for attempted legislation that is explicitly intended to reduce instances of online sex trafficking, which I think we could all say is like an important issue, but that these laws so vaguely define sex trafficking that critics have said that really all internet content that deals with sexuality, so again, even websites that may acknowledge or include LGBTQ people, could be at risk. In Texas, a judge recently upheld the state's abortion ban by citing the Comstock Act, which was this series of laws that were passed in the 1870s on the urging of a man, Anthony Comstock, who opposed both pornography and contraception. This is in the aftermath of the Civil War that I spoke about earlier. So I think for researchers and policymakers and just Americans in general, taking account of like the broad social and historical context of this intersection of sexual politics and religion can help us sort of navigate this really complicated, tricky terrain. So maybe helping us answer some questions like, is there a dog whistle here being used for some ulterior motive? What are these laws really about? And maybe to what extent do laws match the American public, in terms of their beliefs and attitudes?
Yeah. Are there websites or resources that you would recommend for folks that, want to know more about how to approach these issues, whether you're like a church leader or just somebody in the community?
Oh, that's a great question. So I would say one of the best ways to sort of stay informed is to look at language of laws themselves. So like the ACLU, I'm trying to think of organizations that wouldn't spark sort of being really politicized or political. But there are many organizations that are tracking anti-LGBTQ legislation. The ACLU is one of them that, categorizes different kinds of laws where you can see the actual language included in the laws. I think knowing what legislation says directly is a good way to try to cut through some of the noise, and that's a way to be informed.
That's really good. And we're currently doing kind of an ongoing, not really a series. I'm not really quite sure what to call it, but it's basically a method to help people do their own research. So one of the videos that we're just finishing up that we should be published here in the next couple of weeks is using ChatGPT to analyze the contents of a bill. So for instance, like for people that don't know, like if you are a paid subscriber to the AI overlords, then you can actually download a PDF, 800-900 pages or whatever, and upload it into ChatGPT and ask for it to provide a summary for you. So that way you don't have to read 900 pages of a bill. You can even ask it, does the bill address anything related to LGBT issues or something like that? And it'll spit it out. So, so kind of to your point about making sure you understand what's in the bill, is really important, but who's got time for that? So we rely on our AI brothers that are, slowly going to be taking over the world, I'm sure. So,
yeah. And that there are certainly many different political organizations that will give you their recap. And so to see maybe I'll try to find some different hot takes on both the left and the right, from different organizations to see if their interpretation, how it differs.
Yeah. So how can people get a hold of your books?
You can find the books wherever you buy your books online or perhaps in some local shops. I also read the audio book of the Pornography Wars, which was great fun. So it's out there.
And you have a website too?
I do, yes. KelseyBurke.com, where I store my academic articles, popular articles, and where you can find links to the book.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, hey, I appreciate you spending some time with us, Kelsy. This has been very, very educational and not nearly as like awkward as our other conversation we had with the other sex expert.